Hello, everyone. This week, our third week, gets off to a truncated start, I guess you could say, because of the holiday Monday, so everything gets moved back a day. So this is the screencast that normally would be on a Monday, as it will be next week. And really what is next to the last set of readings in Weston's A Rulebook for Argument, deals with arguments about causes. And a lot of causal arguments show up in jokes. And of course, they'd be faulty causal arguments, which is why they would be jokes. They'd be illogical. But let's take a look and see what Critchley has to say. And it's important, at least for your own reading, that you get these labels he's using. Now, some of you have taken math courses that use signs. You might think of these as signs, these ways of showing correlations. A causal argument basically is saying one thing leads to another. That's it. And E1 is the first event. E2 is the second event. And your argument about causes is always one leads to the other. It can be a simple argument, but usually you need a lot of proof, or you're using a faulty causal argument and you're making people laugh. Now, as you read through the chapter, keep an eye on those signs. He's kind of making it more digestible mentally because you can keep those correlations, one thing leading to another, all the way through his discussion of how these work. And let's try a little demonstration. Remember, it's a joke, so it's a causal argument that's going to be faulty. And they usually have a false cause or sometimes a foolish outcome, which is the case here. A woman goes to the racetrack and decides to stroll through the stable area before she goes to the betting window. She sees a priest whispering to a horse. That horse wins the race. She hadn't placed a bet on that horse, so she went back down the stable area and sees the priest whispering to another horse. She places a bet on it to win, but the horse comes in last. She sees the priest walking by, so she stops him and tells him that she saw him talking to two different horses and asked why the outcome was not the same. The priest said, "I think you have a problem. You don't know the difference between a blessing and the last rites." That's a causal joke. The priest would say the same thing to each horse. Well, not exactly, right? So there's a faulty premise. Punchline, big difference between a blessing and the last rites. And of course, it's a false cause. Talking to a horse doesn't affect the outcome, whether it's the last rites or a blessing. So I hope that helps, that jokes as causal arguments, of course, are going to be illogical arguments. So something will be messed up, usually the cause, sometimes the outcome, the E2 part, right? Let's talk about what's happening for the first part of this week as we're getting into the third week and we're sort of setting up for the fourth week here. And I've tried to separate things out a little bit so everything's not hitting you all at once. But remember, you've got an essay to finish that's due Thursday. So there are the reading questions on what we were just discussing. Well, it wasn't disgusting, but we were discussing it. And That's due Thursday, the paper. If you have questions, you can ask them anytime. And the second set of extra credit questions are coming. And of course, they're about a causal argument. So let me show it to you the way you would see it. I'll use the student view here. Yeah, it's not open yet, but it will be. And as you know, it's a causal argument, so that's the easy part. And here's the question. It's going to tell you a joke, and you're going to have to spot the correlations. That you don't have to number them as E1 or E2 if you don't want to, but you've got to talk about the causality here. There we go. Now you need the logical conclusion, of course, and the punchline, and the correlation. That's where one part leads to another or correlates with another. So there's the joke. Read through it. And that's basically it. And you'll pick up 10 points of extra credit if you do well on it. And you'll see that a new essay is going to get assigned, the final essay of the course, coming later in the week, and I'll talk about that when we do the second screencast. And there's also a comic argument analysis, but it's optional. In other words, if you like the score you got in the first one, which you'll see at the beginning of the week, you can pass on the second one, because I'll just use the highest score of the two. So that's what's going on. Quite a few things are coming along this week, and two of them are leaning into next week. I just want to give you some time to work, but first, don't get ahead of yourself. Remember that this comes due Thursday. So I'm hoping you're well along with it. And if you've had any questions, you've already asked them, or you're getting ready to ask me what you are wondering about. My best advice is, if you're having trouble starting, just generally cover these first 4 things on the to-do list in a paragraph or two, just in a general way, and then get to the specifics in later paragraphs. And I'm going to make sure in the Writer's Toolbox you've got plenty used as far as in-text citations and other elements, the MLA format sample, and so on. And also conclusion paragraphs, if you want some tips on that. So keep that in mind, and I would say, once you've taken care of the short arguments, short assignments rather, that one's due Wednesday, 3 reading questions, and then take note that the discussions aren't coming due until Thursday, so you got some time to work on this essay. So if you have questions, don't hesitate to ask them, and just stay familiar with the texts and be sure to keep them handy as you work. Have a great week.